Díomh agus fáilte go dtí an seminar Lína le Slí Eile. Is Misha Nancy Serrano. I'm a member of Slí Eile and I'll be providing the opening and closing remarks for the session today. Ona Line from Slí Eile will be facilitating the questions with our speakers. The title of tonight's webinar is The Energy Charter Treaty, Compensating Corporations, Blocking Climate Justice. We hope you'll all stay till the end because we're going to have some music with Siobhan Kavanagh, who'll be closing the session around 9 p.m. To start, a brief introduction to Slí Eile. We're an anti-capitalist grassroots group made up of activists involved in different struggles: feminism, refugee solidarity, climate justice, and worker solidarity, to name a few. We formed in 2019 with the aim of building a movement on the island of Ireland to resist climate change and its driving force of capitalism. During the last year, we've run a series of webinars from farming and food sovereignty in Ireland to ecofascism and feminist economics and the politics of care. Most recently, in January, we ran a webinar on CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the European Union and Canada. This was ahead of the very rushed Dáil vote, where our government would decide whether we would agree to the very dangerous investment protection element of the deal, known as the Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, or the Investor Court System, ICS. These mechanisms facilitate foreign corporations suing countries in tribunals outside of domestic or EU courts if they make changes in policies which they deem could affect their future profits. This, of course, is particularly important now, as the need to slow down climate chaos is ever more urgent. In the case of CETA, in order for ISDS or ICS to be brought in, each EU member state must agree to it. And at the time of the webinar in January, this vote was imminent in Ireland. Now we know it will take a little bit longer because a High Court case has been initiated to find out whether it's even constitutional for the Dáil to vote on this without a referendum. And there's at least 2 Oireachtas committees who are going to review it, and perhaps even up to 9. So we have a little bit more time now. To make the link between this and tonight's webinar, well, Ireland is one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have ISDS or ICS already, with the only exception being the Energy Treaty Charter. Before we get into tonight's session, we'd like to make some broader points on these trade deals and corporate protections. It's important to acknowledge that these investor protection mechanisms have been in trade deals for a long time. They have been badly affecting countries in the global south long before they became as prevalent in the global northern countries. They were created in the 1950s, and they're a legacy of an era when colonial Western powers sought to protect their investments, in other words, their exploitation of raw materials and deeply unjust exploitation of people as workers in countries that were beginning to decolonize in the political sense. It's an absolute shame to say that only now these deals are getting any attention in wealthy countries, because finally they are affecting Western Europe. They are part of a story of continuing exploitation of the global south following political decolonization. We must say no to them, not just in Ireland and Europe, but no to all other deals that tie people in the global south into deals with Europe on our behalf. So any discussion on these deals must acknowledge that they are neo-colonial creation and an instrument of capitalism, giving rights to private corporations, specifically their legitimate expectation to profit above those of the people and planet. And that the fight against these deals is part of a greater struggle against corporate power, which fundamentally promotes competition in markets over public provision of services and gives strong legal rights to corporations over and above people. This brings us tidily into the theme of today's session, the Energy Charter Treaty, and an introduction to our speakers follows. We'd like to welcome once again Fabian Flues from PowerShift, based in Germany, which was one of the speakers we had on our CETA webinar in January. Many of the live examples he gave us then against the investor-state dispute settlement were from the Energy Charter Treaty, actually. And most of us hadn't really heard about this charter. Again, the only treaty that Ireland is party to where it can be sued under the ISDS. We've invited Fabian back today to provide an overview of the Energy Charter Treaty, the ECT, and particularly relevant now, given it's being reviewed by the European Commission. We'd also like to welcome today Andrej Gnezda from Umanotera, an organization in Slovenia. Andrej has plenty of experience challenging mega trade deals such as CETA, with TTIP before it, and now the Energy Charter Treaty. We're going to hear about a current ISDS case that's being taken under the ECT, suing Slovenia for taking measures to protect their groundwater, from fracking. We will also hear from grassroots plans there aimed at banning fracking altogether. We're also delighted to have with us today Susan Breen from Shale Must Fall and Deep Green Resistance. Susan is going to share with us an update on the reality of fracking in Ireland, which was effectively banned in the south of Ireland, but we still face the threat of facilitating liquefied natural gas, or LNG, through a terminal based in Kerry. And while in the north, there is no such ban on fracking, despite massive grassroots and political support to do so. Finally, we'll hear how we can further resist this as we connect with affected communities globally. So just to introduce the format of the evening, and then we'll get going. We will start with an introduction from Fabian to the Energy Treaty, followed by 2 rounds of questions to the panelists, which will be facilitated by Owen. And then we'll have a final round of questions from the audience. So please do write your questions in the chat if you can before 8:30 p.m. to get them in. And if you'd like us to clarify any terms and technicalities, pop them in the chat and we'll get back to you where possible during the webinar. So thanks again for tuning in, and I'll hand you over first to Fabian for the introduction to the Energy Charter.
Great. Thank you very much, Nancy. And I'll try to share my screen now. Oh, 1 second. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much to Slí Eile for the invitation to speak here tonight and to give a short introduction to the Energy Charter Treaty. I have 15 minutes, I think, to talk about it. So there might be a few things that we can't fully clarify in the presentation, but if you have questions or things are unclear, you can write them in the chat, or if things remain unclear after the webinar, you're very welcome to also send me an email afterwards. What I want to do now is give you a brief introduction to what the Energy Charter Treaty is, highlight a few cases under the Energy Charter Treaty, show a bit where the dangers for climate and climate policy are, and give you a very brief overview of what's happening there at the moment, especially from civil society side. So the Energy Charter Treaty is an agreement from the early 1990s, and it's exactly what Nancy described in the introduction. It was the invention of European governments who wanted their oil and gas companies to access the oil and gas reserves in Central Asia and in Eastern Europe, and to ensure that no one could touch these companies when they were investing in oil and gas there. They came up with this treaty, the Energy Charter Treaty. And what the Energy Charter Treaty includes are a number of rules on trade and transit of energy, but in particular on investments. And the one thing we will be focusing on tonight is that this treaty allows investors to use a specific mechanism, a legal mechanism, against states in the energy sector. I'll explain in a minute how that works, but before then, I wanted to show you who is currently a member of the Energy Charter Treaty. So here on this map in yellow, you see the countries that are full members of the Energy Charter Treaty. And it's, as you can see, all of Western and Eastern Europe, and then a number of countries in Central Asia, and then Japan. So most of these countries joined the treaty relatively early on, and a few came on board later, including Yemen or Mongolia. And then in blue, you see countries that are currently candidates to join this treaty. And there you can see a focus as well on Asia, but especially on West Africa and some East African countries. And we'll get back to that towards the end as well, what this process of expanding the membership of the ECT means. And then finally in light green are countries that decided to leave the ECT, which are Italy and Russia. So I already said the main problem and the main danger of the ECT is the possibility for investors to start claims against states. And so I wanted to give you an example of how these claims actually work. So what we see here is a screenshot of a proceeding. You have an investor here on the right-hand side, or the lawyers representing the investor, that's Vattenfall, which is in this case suing Germany, which is represented by the lawyers here on the left-hand side. The reason why we have this image is because the German parliament insisted on being able to follow the proceedings, and so they were forced to put this on YouTube. Usually this kind of footage doesn't exist, and the proceedings are largely secret. So Vattenfall started this because they had a problem with the German nuclear phase out, and so they decided to sue Germany on the basis of the Energy Charter Treaty. So they're not using German laws or international European laws. What they're using is the Energy Charter Treaty. And so in front, you see three old men, and they are three arbitrators who decide on this case. So they run the proceedings, and they're in the end making the decision whether Germany has to pay compensation to Vattenfall. And you can see these two arrows. They're both going only in one direction. So only Vattenfall is able to sue Germany, and only Germany will need to pay compensation to Vattenfall if they lose a case. So it's a really a one-way system in which an investor can sue a government if they claim that a government policy hurts their profits. And the only basis for their decision is this treaty, the Energy Charter Treaty. And the only three people who can decide it are those three arbitrators, which were picked by Vattenfall in Germany. There's basically no way to challenge their decision. So I already mentioned a few of the elements that makes this so dangerous. These cases can be kept completely secret, and we know there are cases that we don't know about. They appear in some statistics, but we have no idea who's suing for how much and what the case is about. Investors can choose half of the arbitrators, so those three people decide, but the investors can pick half of them. And so they can have a big influence over who will decide who is right in these cases. Particularly problematic is that the property rights that this treaty, the Energy Charter Treaty, gives to investors are extremely broad and vaguely defined. And so it's in the end, those three arbitrators, they will decide if property rights have been breached or not. It's very common in these cases to compensate future profits, which is unusual in normal legal and national legal systems. So the amount of money that companies can win in these cases are much, much higher than in national legal systems. There's basically no possibility to appeal. So once a decision has been made, it's basically final. And these decisions can be enforced almost anywhere in the world. And so that makes it very powerful. And that also means that those cases and those tribunals are a great way to pressure a government, because the whole system is so one-sided and so much in favor of the investors, that just by threatening such a case, you can already potentially win a lot. Under the Energy Charter Treaty, we have seen 136 of these investor cases against governments, and that's a massive increase from the first years of the treaty, when we had very few cases, to now having up to 30 cases a year. I want to give you a couple of examples of these cases. One very recent one is a German energy company, one of the biggest in Europe, RWE, versus the Netherlands. The Netherlands, to have a chance of fulfilling their Paris commitments, were discussing a coal exit by 2030. And RWE, alongside another German coal company, Uniper, had built coal power stations recently in 2015, and in 2016 they were opened. So the year of the Paris Agreement and the year after the Paris Agreement. And when the law was being discussed, they threatened to sue the Netherlands under the ECT. And they were hoping that this threat would weaken the law, and the Netherlands would not run the risk of having such a case against them, and they would prolong the time for coal burning in the Netherlands. But they didn't do that and decided to go for the coal exit. And now RWE is suing in such an arbitration tribunal for 1.4 billion euros of compensation. Another case is the German coal phase out, which came about also because there was a lot of activism around coal in Germany, and many groups were pressuring the government to advance a coal exit. And what the German government wanted to do was that the companies that are burning coal right now sign an agreement that they won't sue the government under the ECT, so that they sign a legal document where they give up their right to sue under the ECT. And the companies did that, but they got the money then basically for free. So in order to sign this document to give up their right to sue, they got a much higher compensation than they would have otherwise gotten. And there are calculations that were getting 2 billion euros too much in these negotiations. And the government has admitted that giving up their right to sue under the ECT was very important for the amount of compensation they received. There are more examples. An oil company called Rockhopper from the UK is demanding $275 million plus interest for a ban on oil drilling in Italy. And interestingly, this company has only invested around $30 or $40 million, but they want all their future profits to be compensated as well. And in France, when France decided to phase out oil and gas drilling in its territory, another company, Vermilion, threatened to sue France under the ECT, and the oil and gas drilling ban was delayed and weakened, and then they withdrew their threat. So what we can see is under the ECT, companies can claim really high compensation in arbitration tribunals. They can increase the price of phasing out fossil fuels even without going to these tribunals, just by threatening to go or by giving up their right to sue. They have a great bargaining tool, and they can delay and weaken climate action, as in the case of Vermilion. And one thing that we should keep in mind is that very often the cases where companies use these threats or use these claims is when movements are successful in accelerating fossil fuel phase out, of banning a particularly harmful practice, because then companies can argue that their legitimate expectations were violated. They couldn't have expected a change in government policy because of public pressure, because of protests. And so these are very often attacked in these tribunals. If we zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture, as a Canadian academic who's done a lot of work on these questions, and she writes, investment protection agreements like the ECT were created to protect the status quo. The Paris Agreement, however, requires radical change. And that really gets to the core of it, because what these agreements like the ECT are about are protecting property rights of whoever owns a property in whatever it is in through a very, very strong mechanism and defining property rights very, very broadly. And so if we think of all the things that need to happen for a just transition, this is just completely contrary to what we actually need to do. So now looking a bit more practically, what is actually covered by the Energy Charter Treaty? In Europe, there was a consortium of journalists was looking into the ECT, and they actually tried to tabulate the amount of fossil fuel assets that fall under the protection of the ECT. And there, the value they arrived at for the EU, the UK, and Switzerland was 345 billion euros of fossil fuel assets. And you can see here that the UK is particularly high because of all the oil and gas drilling that's going on there. But other countries like Germany, you also have more than 50 billion euros of assets that fall under the ECT. This is quite conservative because in their calculation, it was impossible to include future profits. So they just looked at what the assets are currently worth, and the amount of compensation investors could claim could possibly be much higher. I also looked up the figures for Ireland, and the infrastructure that they looked at that is protected under the ECT in Ireland is about 1 billion euros. And 3/4 of this is in gas power plants, and the rest is in oil and gas fields. Now, I briefly wanted to go into something that I already showed you on the map. So the ECT currently mostly covers Europe and Central Asian countries, with a few exceptions. But there are plans to expand this treaty around the world. And this is particularly dangerous because, as you can imagine, if law firms and investors manage to threaten powerful and well-resourced countries like France or Germany, how badly they can intimidate and threaten countries that have much less resources, monetary resources, but also administrative capacity to deal with these extremely complex and expensive cases. And so I just highlighted a few countries here, but you could really pick almost any on these lists that are all somewhere in the process of joining the Energy Charter Treaty. So we see some of them are particularly resource-rich countries, like Iraq with oil, and Nigeria as well. Some are countries with a huge amount of existing investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, like China. And then you have some of the poorest countries in the world, like Sierra Leone or Niger, which also has very large uranium mines, that would then suddenly all fall under the investment protection of the ECT. So this is extremely dangerous. And even though there is some PR that this process was halted for the moment, we know that the activities to include and bring in more and more countries into the ECT is ongoing. And it's really a neo-colonialist project to exploit the natural resources of these countries. So now, to finish, just a brief outlook on what's happening at the moment. There are negotiations ongoing to modernize the Energy Charter treaties. the Energy Charter Treaty. But from everything we've seen so far, we already know that these negotiations will fail and that they will not bring the changes that are actually necessary to disarm this treaty. So even the most progressive proposals, which are coming from the EU, are not nearly enough to stop the danger of this treaty. And it could take many, many years to complete these negotiations, during which, of course, countries can be sued as it's happening at the moment. What we demand is very simple. Countries that are currently members must exit the ECT, and there is some movement towards that, and I'll show that on the next slide. The big catch there is that there is a zombie clause, which is a mechanism that the ECT applies for another 20 years after a country has left the treaty. And so it just shows again how anti-democratic these treaties are, that even if a country democratically decides to leave such a treaty, they're still bound by it for 20 years. But there are probably some legal ways around this treaty and around this clause, and it's also used as an excuse to not try to get out of the treaty. And our second demand is that the treaty must not be expanded to new countries. I'll skip the last point for now. And now for exiting the ECT, we have a few that have been quite strongly in favor, including some relatively powerful countries in the EU, like France and Spain. We had more than 500 climate scientists who said we have to get out of this treaty. We have a group of countries and institutions that are kind of a bit on the fence. Luxembourg and Austria, and also the European Parliament has been, of all bigger institutions, by far the most critical. And then we have a large group of countries that are blocking the exit at the moment. The European Commission is there, even though they're probably not the worst and have said they will consider leaving. But countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Portugal have all said they want to remain in the treaty. And for Ireland, I put a question mark because we're actually currently lacking a bit of information where the Irish government stands on this. The UK is strongly in favor of staying and not reforming actually the treaty at all. But the biggest defenders, of course, are the law firms that make millions out of these cases, and the big energy corporations who make even much more from suing governments for climate action. And so, as I said, this was probably a lot of things in a very short amount of time. So here's some further material. And I assume we can share the slides with you in some way. And as I said, you are always very welcome to get back to me also with questions after the webinar. Thanks a lot.
Cool. Thanks a million, Fabian. That was a great overview that you gave there. And I suppose the bit that struck me was the one about the flexibility, and like we're going to have to totally overhaul our whole energy sector, and that we have allowed our hands to be like handcuffed with this, that will fight, and that we're going to have to compensate to try to have this flexibility is yeah, totally crazy, and we need to stop it. And I suppose just from your presentation, like I saw two of the companies, Vermilion, they'd be the operators of the Corrib gas project, and in RWE, they'd be involved in renewables in Ireland as well. And I suppose one other point that I'd like to highlight is that E.ON would have owned the Eden Dairy power plant up to, it was bought by Bordemona 15 years ago, but that would have delayed, or could have delayed, our phase out of peat even more, that we would have had to compensate E.ON, who have used the ECT in other countries, even slow it even more, even though Eden Dairy power plant is still actually burning peat. So I'd like to move on and maybe ask some questions. So we wanted to highlight a specific case in Slovenia that's been taken. So if I could ask Andrej to highlight that we've heard that there's a strong movement in Slovenia to seeking to stop fracking. And if you could tell us a bit about that movement, and then also the court case which a UK company, Ascent Resources, is currently taking against Slovenia through the ECT in relation to fracking. Could you give us a bit of background on that case, please?
Yeah, hi. Thanks thank you for inviting us. Yeah, it's true. We do have an existing fracking case in Slovenia where the investor in 2011 started some minor fracking projects, and basically the question came down to the fact whether an environmental impact assessment needs to be done for some serious large-scale fracking. And this procedure of the so-called screening procedure took place where they were trying to decide whether the environmental agency basically had to decide whether the Ascent, the company from UK-based company, along with Geoenergo, the subsidiary of a state-owned Slovenian company, need to obtain an environmental impact assessment and an environmental permit. And basically, the environmental agency decided that yes, they do need to obtain these permits, and for the sole reason or the sole fact that the environmental agency decided so, the Ascent companies started threatening with a claim under the Energy Charter Treaty. Basically, during this procedure, Ascent all the time tried to convince the authorities that this environmental impact assessment does not need to be done because it's an existing well, that this is not a new procedure, so they do not need a new permit, while the environmental agency decided otherwise. And it's basically, it came down to the fact that because the environmental agency said they need to obtain a permit, they immediately started threatening with a lawsuit. And this lawsuit is now weighted at some 120 million euros. They claim they have invested 50 million euros into the project, which was never actually substantiated, and some 70 million of potential lost revenues, which was also highlighted by Fabian, where companies can actually claim potential profits they would make out of the project in the future. But also these numbers seem to be very inflated. But during the procedure of obtaining this permit, basically deciding whether a permit needs to be obtained, there were serious pressures on our environmental agency by the investor themselves or representatives, stakeholders, shareholders of the investor, and also even politicians from the UK. For instance, there were meetings from the UK ambassador at the environmental agency asking when the procedure will be finished and things like that. And once our Minister of Environment found that out, he decided to do basically an internal review of how the procedure took place and whether there were some pressures on the decision makers that should have not been made. And the procedure showed that there was interfering into the environmental agency's work, showing that they were not basically in the position to adopt an expert standalone decision that was autonomous. And actually the case then was even forwarded to the police to look into it further, what exactly went on. So the end result was that the environmental agency in the end decided they do need to obtain a permit. That was reaffirmed by the Ministry of Environment itself. And once the investor also raised this issue at the court also said that, reaffirmed this decision. So basically here we have a nice example of what the Energy Charter Treaty can do, where if a government decides that for a fracking project you need to do an environmental impact assessment, the investor is in a position to threaten with a lawsuit. And obviously this can be a very big hurdle in adopting serious climate policies to prevent the climate breakdown. And we have to take into account also the local opposition, where people were strongly against the project, organizing protests, asking their local representatives to ban the project. Now we have a motion in place to ban entirely fracking in Slovenia in our legislation. And obviously, again, the ECT being this hurdle where the expectations of the people that live here are being suppressed potentially because of this, this threat of a serious suit.
Great. Thanks a million, Andrej. That was a very good overview. And I suppose to us in Ireland, it brings to mind, you know, what could have, how much harder it would have been to get the ban on fracking if we had, would say, active cases being taken against the Irish government on fracking as well. So maybe around that, I'd like to ask Sue to come in, Sue Breen, who's with Shale Must Fall and Deep Green Resistance, who's been campaigning on LNG and fracking for many years. So I'd like to ask, just to give an update on what's the current situation with LNG terminals and we'll say fracking and oil and gas in general in Ireland. To give us an update, Sue, please.
Okay, thanks a million, Owen, and thanks so much everyone for Slí Eile for having me here. First of all, I suppose I'll just kind of explain what LNG is, just in the Irish context, what we're kind of looking at, and then what the current situation is. I'll try not to rant. Owen knows that that's a very likely thing to happen during this conversation, but I'll try my best. So first of all, what is LNG? Just for anyone who doesn't know, that's liquefied natural gas, where it's turned into liquid by supercooling to enable transportation from country to country without a pipeline. So that's what LNG is. That's what we're talking about. And in an Irish context, the most imminent threat, I suppose, would be the proposed terminal at Shannon LNG, which is on the Kerry side of the Shannon estuary. So this would be a LNG terminal that would be pumping, you know, huge amounts of water, supercooled water into the estuary there, killing marine life, putting the communities at risk. And then I'm just going to talk about kind of the implications, and a lot of what we do in Shale Must Fall is trying to connect the dots between, you know, import, export, trying to join up communities from where LNG is produced and where it's delivered and where it will be consumed. So what I'm going to do is kind of talk a little bit about the repercussions for the people in actually Texas and Pennsylvania, where the fracked gas would be coming from for Shannon LNG if the project was to go ahead. So first of all, what's the problem with fracking? For anyone who's not aware, fracking is, you know, drilling up to a mile deep to reach shale rock, and fracking fuel is then injected at high pressure. The fracking fuel contains 600 plus toxic chemicals. Some of them are undisclosed. You know, there's known carcinogens. We have formaldehyde, benzene, methanol, others. You know, it's an absolute toxic cocktail. Lab studies have linked them to reproductive harm, brain and behavioral issues, immune issues, cancer, heart disease. So what's done is this fuel is pumped at extremely high pressure to fracture the rock, and that sends trapped methane up through the well. So some water returns to the surface, some stays below to become more toxic, and then possibly, you know, seep into aquifers or do whatever else. I mean, what could go wrong? So there's a rapidly expanding body of evidence for years about the dangers of fracking. So in 2017, the Irish government took the wonderful decision to ban fracking here in Ireland, but they're still willing to inflict all that on other communities in other parts of the world, which is incredibly hypocritical. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, what happens to the communities in Pennsylvania and Texas, some of whom, you know, we've activists we're connected to in Shale Must Fall, who know firsthand the devastation that's been caused by this industry. I mean, we have families with tap water that will ignite, families with children that have ended up with lesions all over their bodies because of, you know, from bathing in the water. One child study in Texas found that in the biomarkers in children, there was some of the fracking chemicals were 91 times higher than the average person in the US. They also found extremely high levels of other endocrine disruptors, carcinogens. Babies born in Texas near frequent flaring are 50% more likely to be born prematurely. People in Pennsylvania, a study that was done there, far higher risk of infant mortality, hospitalizations for skin, urinary issues, premature births, asthma, fatigue, heart failures, and of course clusters of Ewing sarcoma, which is an extremely rare form of cancer. And then for children as well, up to 3 times more likely to develop leukemia. So I mean, absolutely horrific repercussions for the communities where this is happening. And okay, so that's for the community. So for the environment. So fracking is the largest super emitter of methane in the world. Gram to gram methane is 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Fracking is responsible for over 50% of all the world's increased methane emissions from fossil fuels and 1/3 of the total methane emissions from all sources over the last 10 years. 3.5% of US shale developed is emitted into the environment in fugitive emissions. And a conservative estimate of the shale gas imported as LNG into Ireland would create a footprint that's 44% greater than that of coal. Okay, so that's why, just a bit of an overview as to why we are so opposed to this going ahead, and why we want our ban on LNG. So why are they doing this? So I suppose in a time of dwindling resources, this is a kind of geopolitical struggle for energy dominance by the US. And as we saw after the Trump and Juncker agreement in 2018, imports of LNG into Europe rose by 760%. So there's a massive, massive influx of LNG coming into Europe and massive, massive pressure for these LNG terminals to be built. And again, in a capitalist system, trade is always going to be God, and it will always be corporate greed before any kind of environmental need or a human need or whatever else. So the main focus so far, the response to this, I suppose, by the public and by activists has been mainly focused around Shannon LNG. I think, well, anything I've been involved in has been focused a lot on Shannon LNG over the last couple of years. So there's been amazing work done by numerous different groups who have just put years of work into trying to prevent this going ahead. In 2019, it really became a national issue. XOR got behind it as well, and it became one of the demands for Rebellion Week. It got national media coverage. Suddenly, political parties were talking about it, and suddenly it became a really big issue. And the government response, the government came into power in June. The work of a lot of grassroots activists caused a green wave in kind of the elections, because there was suddenly a huge amount of awareness about the environment that wasn't there previously. So the Green Party had a position to get into government. They promised Shannon LNG and LNG itself, LNG importations were going to be an issue. Shannon was going to be a red line issue for them. In November, New Fortress Energy, who is the company that's involved in Shannon LNG, they lost all their development rights when they were challenged by Friends of the Irish Environment in the High Court. So huge, major wins, incredibly optimistic time. It really looked like we were winning this fight. And the programme for government then promised not to support LNG importation and to remove Shannon LNG from the Projects of Common Interest list in 2021. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Projects of Common Interest list means that they can override planning because it's seen as something that's in the essential good of everybody. So they also billions in funding as well. So the JOCA report that was released also said a ban could be brought into the climate bill. And a policy statement was promised that would establish the government approach. So we had all these things in the pipeline, excuse the pun, and the government, seemed to be really getting behind this, and they seemed to be listening, and it looked like we were going to get our ban, and it looked like Shannon LNG was definitely, off the cards. So what did the government deliver? We've just had a climate bill published last month, which involved no ban on LNG. There's still no policy statement being delivered, months and months on. On the 30th of March, Friends of the Irish Environment were back in the High Court to fight Shannon LNG's right to remain on the PCI list, and they were defeated. And this is the best part. In court, the Department of the Environment and Climate Action, headed by Minister Eamon Ryan, who's leader of the Green Party, they argued in the High Court for Shannon LNG to remain on the PCI list. So they were actually fighting, even though they got into government on the promise of Shannon LNG being off the table, they went into the High Court and fought to have it kept on the PCI list. I mean, it's actually beggars belief. So they used an existing loophole under Article 15 of the legislation, which is kind of related to relevant bodies having to take climate mitigation into account in their decisions. But this loophole means that the government are actually exempt from this. So there can be oversight by government, but there's no oversight of the government. So the government can't be taken to court if they don't fulfill their duties in terms of the environment or what's expected of them. They have a total get out of jail card, which is obviously a major loophole. Now, Eamon Ryan and his department used that in court to fight for Shannon LNG to remain on the PCI list, but they never, knowing obviously that it was there because they used it in court, they didn't do anything about it in the new climate bill. So that's the level of just outrageous behaviour that we're dealing with in Irish politics at the moment. So yeah, I mean, they're actually actively fighting for us to be locked into another 30 to 50 years of fossil fuel. And now the Shannon LNG project, New Fortress Energy on the 20th of March, they announced that they were applying again for planning permission on the Shannon estuary. So, you know, we can see that they were handed everything. I mean, they had people from Friends of the Irish Environment, NUI Galway, the Human Rights Clinic, all highly skilled legal advisors, you know, doing all the work for them. This was handed to them on a plate. They could have quashed Shannon LNG, absolutely could have quashed Shannon LNG. And no, instead they're fighting for us to be forced into this project. So what it looks like is that Ireland is kind of being ushered towards being an emissions haven, where we'll have American companies, you know, over here, kind of tax-free. They'll be powering the data centers with US frack gas, and that's what we're kind of being ushered towards. In terms of other prospects, then earlier this year, the government announced that we were handing out no more oil and gas licenses. Yay! But all existing licenses are still valid until some of them until 2034. So that obviously still leaves us open, but the government got a good clap on the back from the oil industry for, you know, keeping those licenses active. So we have Inishkey gas prospect, which is close to the Carb gas field off Mayo. That's Europa who is involved there, and Barry Row oil field off Cork, and that's the majority is owned by Providence. And again, just linking back to Fabian's presentation there, you know, when you think about the ECT could be a part of the rationale behind these decisions. And certainly, I mean, you can see how impossible it is nearly to make the government act on any of these things, even if there's no kind of risk of being sued or whatever in place. Once we're locked into these trade deals, it makes it nearly impossible to make them listen or to make them actually act on behalf of the environment and act in a conscious environmental way.
Cool.
So then up the north, currently there's a moratorium in the UK, which was introduced in 2015, but the moratorium is subject to research. It's quite a shaky position. It's not anything that's actually that sound. It's not something that's really given much protection. So currently Hatch Regeneris, which is a company based in Calgary, is conducting research to provide policy options. Now, no one within the research team appears to have any expertise on public health, so that doesn't seem to be being factored in at all, apart from possibly in a cursory manner. And it's likely the sole focus will be on kind of just the economic benefits, etc. And Hatch Regeneris, this company, when they did the Welsh report, they misrepresented Public Health England's comment in relation to public health. So we can already see that they have and are willing to behave in a way that is not kind of particularly genuine or trustworthy.
Cool.
So
thanks a million, Sue.
Sorry, Owen.
We'll come back to you shortly again for the next question.
I'm sorry, I told you I wouldn't rant, but
thanks a million for that overview. It was really good, and what stood out for me was that 760%, was it? increase in US fracked gas coming in since that meeting with Juncker and Trump, and like at a time where we're putting out EU Green Deals and all of this, that we are starting to, that we have to be fighting against building new infrastructure in Ireland, and that we're totally ramping up fracked gas into Europe defies any logic, and you really have to question like everyone's genuineness in putting out this when this is going on alongside it, kind of, you know. So maybe following on to that, Fabian, I'd have a question for you on what you see as the current and future risks to Ireland in relation to ECT, and both kind of the LNG and the gas that Sue was talking about, and then any other energy projects that you worry about.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. Before going into the specifics, I just want to mention one thing, which is the people who defend the Energy Charter Treaty, they often say what it provides is the rule of law and certainty for investors. And that's why we need such a treaty, because it creates stable conditions for investors and the rule of law. But when we look into it, it's actually the opposite is the case. As I showed in the presentation, these decisions are made by three lawyers who often earn a lot of money from these cases. And it's very hard to almost impossible to appeal them. And so the outcomes of these cases are extremely unpredictable. So you could have a case coming and the investors win it, and then almost the same case coming and the investors lose it. But up to the minute that the decision is made, it's extremely hard to say what the outcome of these cases is. And so when we look at the situation in Ireland and also the projects that are going on, there's a lot of potential for cases to go forward, and it's very hard to predict what the outcome could be. It's really almost, it feels like it's being left up to chance, and that creates a lot of uncertainty in favor of the investor, because the investor doesn't have anything to lose. If they lose a case, nothing happens. But if the government loses a case, they have to pay millions, hundreds of millions, or billions to the investor. And so when we look at where those cases often arise, it's often around licenses and permitting. So in all big and Sue was and both Sue and Andrej were telling us examples of that most big infrastructure projects, especially fossil fuel infrastructure, have a multi-permitting, multi-licensing process. So you get a first permit, and then you have to apply for another, and you have to fulfill certain requirements. And what investors then often allege is, by giving a first permit, the government created a legitimate expectation on their side that they could expect the project to go ahead, that they could, because they got the first permit, also get the second, the third, and the environmental permit, and so on. And when they don't get it, that this was against the, that they weren't treated fairly, and that it was against their legitimate expectations, which are protected by the Energy Charter Treaty. And so I think a case like Shannon is perfect for such a claim, because you have a government that's kind of going back and forth. It creates a certain expectation that it might walk back on later on. And that's exactly the kind of things that investors seize upon to then file a claim and say they want to be compensated. And one thing that's particularly absurd about these investment treaties and the Energy Charter Treaty is the amount of compensation you can claim even if you haven't invested any money. So there was a scandalous case recently against Pakistan, where a mining company went into Pakistan and tried to establish a copper and gold mine. They never got all the licenses they needed to actually go ahead with the mining project. but when they were finally denied the license to go ahead with the project, they started an ISDS case, and they claimed they had invested a couple or $100 million in the project, but they wanted to be compensated for all the gold and the copper they could have potentially mined there had they gotten all the necessary permits. And so the amount of money they got out of it in the end were more than $4 billion plus interest of $2 billion. So that's $6 billion for a company that had, if it's true at all, invested $100 million in a project that was never economical, never went ahead, never produced a single ounce of gold or a single one of copper. And it's more money than Pakistan received in a recent IMF bailout, and it's more money than Pakistan's entire health budget. And now Pakistan has basically no options left, and they have to pay this. And I think that's the big danger and threat of these cases. You can start with an absurd claim if you got the wrong panel of arbitrators, and remember the company chooses half of them, and they come up with some crazy figure like this one. There's very little you can do, and so this is a big incentive for a government to give in right away and to not risk having such a case going against them. And so, yeah, with the Shannon LNG terminal, it's just another one of those cases where I think all the right ingredients are there for it to go ahead, and maybe we don't know about it. Often these companies have their expensive law firms send letters to a government threatening such a case. A government would hardly admit being blackmailed by a company, so they keep quiet about it, but they let a project go ahead.
Thanks a million, Fabian. That was a very worrying response, and particularly like currently there's no active application permit before any of the planning authorities, but Shannon LNG company has said that they are going to do that. So it really was the time, the climate bill, to have that ban on them, so it was very disappointing that didn't happen. So now maybe I'd go back to Andrej, and that you've been campaigning on a range of the mega trade deals, TTIP, CETA, and the ECT, and just could you give some thoughts on the kind of neo-colonial aspects of these deals that you've seen, and how do you think we can fight against them?
I think this whole investor-state dispute settlement mechanism is definitely one of the most powerful tools, and it basically comes down, for instance, there was a media article titled, "If they're not going to pump gas, then they're going to pump public funds, basically taking our money because we didn't allow them to frack there." And I think it's a very, very powerful tool where the corporations basically just get too much power out of it, and they, in a way, they can take control over the state or demand absurd amounts of money. I think that the Pakistani case was very clear on that how far things can go. But on the other hand, this investor-state dispute settlement mechanism is basically a curative tool where all else fails. While on the other hand, there are also in these so-called modern day trade deals, there are also provisions on regulatory cooperation, where the idea is to bring the regulations of the two contracting parties closer, and closer with the intent of bringing down trade barriers. So basically anything that's a potential obstacle within the existing legislation shall be removed, so that trade can flow easierly. And this means that any potential either environmental conservation rules or consumer protection, worker right protections, all these can be seen as trade barriers and can be removed. And again, it's the corporations being put at the table, and their interests are being put first. And these processes will take place at levels that are prior to any national parliament. So again, they're really getting superpowers with these trade deals, where they get the right to shape regulation, and if all else fails, they can demand absurd amounts of compensation for that. And for going back to Slovenia, for instance, in the case of CETA, where we have been partly successful in advocating against the agreement, there are also provisions saying that for concessions on natural resources extraction are also considered an investment under CETA. So rules on investment protection and investor dispute settlement also apply to these two concessions on natural resources extraction. So for instance, companies holding concessions on water rights and things like that basically have a very powerful tool to decide what they will do with that water resource. And the state has very, very limited ability to control what the company is doing there. And we've been trying to highlight that with our government, and they have taken that on board. But in the end, it comes down to basically all states having to agree to these rules and apply them. And which, on the other hand, is a bit luckily, because we still have, the fact is that we still have all national parliaments that need to ratify the CETA agreement and potentially other agreements. And I think that this is the upside of it, because we have 27 states now potentially having the right to block the agreement entirely. So I think that, and this is where we need to work together in national capitals and in Brussels together to try and see if we can prevent the most damaging aspects or entire agreements, basically, so that we can stop this type of development.
Cool. Thanks a million, Andrej. That was great, and I suppose inspires us to kind of campaign against CETA strongly now before it gets ratified. So that was great, as well as working on the ECT and how we can revoke it. So maybe I'd go back to you, Sue, again. So just, I suppose, on the LNG terminals, what actions can we take in the Irish context to stop LNG, both in Ireland and if it's wider in Europe? And then that we heard you mention in a recent podcast that one of the main aims of Shale Must Fall is to bring the voices of affected communities in the global south to the doorsteps of offending companies in the global north. And how do you do that work with the different communities?
Thanks, Owen. I'll try and be quicker this time. Yeah, so with Shale Must Fall, one of the things that has been our main focus since the beginning has been to kind of use our privilege in the global north to amplify the struggles of the global south, and to be aware of the fact that we're beneficiaries of most of the, our lifestyle is coming on the back of immense destruction and horror in other parts of the world. So recognizing all that, we felt that it's kind of paramount. That's our main aim, is to get their voices heard in as much as we can. So we worked very hard on trying to network and work in a way that everybody has access to everybody else, that we can actually really connect. So we had, we try and have bilingual calls with translators and everything so that we can all be together. We set up subgroups for import export, for embassies, for different companies. So for example, with Total, we had activists in Uganda who were at the coal face, linked up with the members in France who are near the headquarters. So, and the same with even the embassies, for example, in Nepal, where China has plans to start fracking, we went to the Chinese embassy here and we pasted up the testimonies from people in Nepal and their letters saying, we don't want this here. And, and the same, we went to the embassy, the Canadian embassy, bringing testimonies from the members who are in Namibia, who are, now facing God knows what happening because of Recon Africa, and the Canadian-based company. So we tried to join up the dots, join up the fights, and bring, even at all the different protests and actions that we had around the world on both the days of global days of action. We read out testimonies from people in Vaca Muerta who are directly impacted by this, from people in Chihuahua who have no water because it's being shipped to Texas for fracking. So joining up the communities, joining up the dots, and then bringing it to the headquarters and actually going to the people who are doing this. I love that Utah Phillips quote, the earth isn't dying, she's being murdered, and the people who are doing it have names and addresses. So going to the headquarters and letting them know we're in touch with these people and we're going to support them. And so that was one kind of some of the ways that we tried to kind of amplify their voice, and of course asking them, being in touch all the time and asking them what it is they want us to do, how do we project this, and what is the best way for us to do that. So in terms of an Irish context, I suppose for me, looking at last year and the fact that you can be promised the sun, moon and stars by the government and they can still renege, I think being realistic, if you have neoliberal parties in government, you're always going to be headed towards ecocide, because they are always going to have, their allegiance is going to be to business and industry, always. It has to be. If they're a neoliberal party, they have to be. So being realistic in our expectations of the people in power, and being organized, and being kind of strategic, and being willing to take more decisive kind of radical action, because with COVID and, all these things are going to be slipped in because they think now people can't protest, they can't organize because of COVID restrictions, we can do what we want. So we have to be organized, we have to be creative, we have to think of new ways that we can take direct action and be effective. And I think a lot of it is having people who are organized, who are networked, who are trained and skilled up, so that when it comes to actually putting bodies on the line and stopping these projects going ahead, that we can do that, and actually being prepared to do that is one of the most important things. Just in terms of Shale Must Fall, we have actions coming up in May. We're moving in with Shell Must Fall, who are also involved in the coalition, and they have actions planned across Europe to kind of coincide with the AGMs of the oil companies. There will be different things happening, like blockades of petrol stations of that particular company on the particular day that the AGM is happening. So that's something that we're going to be involved in. Then Andrej Gnezda, who have also joined the coalition recently. Their big action this year is focusing on LNG. That's going to be in August. So together we're going to work and have a huge, hopefully, global day of action against LNG. Ireland will be a part of that too. So anybody who is interested, please just contact the Shale Must Fall on any of the social media you'll find on Insta, Facebook, or Twitter. So yeah, to make contact and yeah, trying to come together. And I think we're all isolated from each other at the moment in the current situation. So kind of finding each other again and coming forward as a unified force, and especially having those connections with people who are frontline and kind of respecting their leadership and putting ourselves at their service and fighting these guys tooth and nail. I think that's what we have to aim for as soon as possible.
Thanks a million, Sue. And I think that your international outlook is really needed. And like for too long, we've outsourced our problems or the pollution for our lifestyle and that to other countries, and we need to start to make sure that isn't done again with like fracking and that we stop doing that really. So now some questions from the audience. So I'll go to Fabian first. So the first question, Fabian, is how is regulatory chill measured? As in, how can we know what might happen with relative certainty? And a quick one, if a case goes against the state and the state refuses to pay, what happens?
Yeah, the regulatory chill one is one we get challenged on a lot because it's so hard to prove and so hard to measure. When a government decision goes a certain way, did the letter from a law firm that was a multi-billion-dollar threat tip the balance in that direction, or was it something else? What we do have is some empirical studies from Canada, because Canada is one of the most sued countries under ISDS, under this investment system, investment arbitration system. And Canada has been sued a lot for environmental reasons as well, including by a fracking company that had its permit revoked and then is suing now for $100 million in compensation, even though they never got a bit of gas out of the ground. And in Canada, after they were being sued left, right, and center in these tribunals, they adopted their government, their ways of working in their government. So everything is now being checked, whether there is a potential case that could happen. Government lawyers are becoming much more conservative when it comes to environmental legislation or regulation, because they're afraid that something like this might happen. So there we have some empirical evidence from interviews with government employees who saw the impact of these cases on their own ways of working. But in France, we have the example as well of Vermilion, which threatened a case. The government lowered its targets for the fossil fuel phase out, and the environmental minister, Nicolas Hulot, in the end resigned and said that the pressure of big business lobbies was too strong and he couldn't push through his important agenda items. So we have some of those examples, and they're more than just anecdotes, but it's hard to measure with certainty what an impact it really makes. But the more and more these cases come, the more and more governments preemptively try to work out their legislation in a way that wouldn't cause any such cases. And on the question, what happens if a state doesn't want to pay? So these ISDS cases are administered under certain conventions, international conventions. And almost all countries in the world have signed these conventions. And what these conventions say is, if this arbitration tribunal of 3 lawyers decides something, we're going to accept it as true. And our courts are going to accept it as true. And if you come with it to our courts, they're not going to fact check it, they're going to implement it. And so what investors do when countries refuse to pay, they go to another country, in particular the US and Australia, because they're particularly open to these kind of cases, and they try to seize assets of the state that doesn't want to pay. So there could be a painting that's currently lent from the Irish National Gallery to a gallery in Australia that's property of the Irish state. That could be seized. It could be government-owned companies that have assets somewhere, a bank account in the US. And so with these kind of court cases in regular courts to enforce these decisions, investors have a very strong tool to go anywhere in the world where they find a court or a judge that's favorable to them and start seizing assets of another country. And that can really impair the way countries operate abroad. And so in most cases, they just pay.
Cool. Great. Thanks a million. So the next question we have is for Andrej. And so the question is, the idea that a country can be sued for asking for an environmental impact assessment is shocking. We are also campaigning against CETA. Proponents of CETA say that every country has the right to regulate. This is clearly not the case here. Do you think this current case could also be taken under CETA?
Yeah, definitely. I think it would completely fly under CETA as well. As I mentioned before, CETA clearly states that holding concessions on natural resource extraction is considered an investment. So all rules regarding investment treatment and protection apply for that concession as well. And despite this discourse of saying that yes, the government can regulate despite all these provisions within the FTAs, yes, the state may regulate, but the state might also have to pay for their regulation. I think this is the bottom line. it never says it will not pay for its regulation. If that was written there, then maybe we could talk about having the right to regulate and the legislator being an autonomous subject. But with these rules, I think that in the end, it comes down to what Fabian was saying. There are 3 arbitrators that decide on the case, and they are inclined or biased towards ruling in favor of the investor. And in this cases, this could totally become a new claim, and it might come costly to the state.
Cool. Great. Thanks for that. So the next question is for Fabian again. Are the EU countries in favor of the treaty trying to support their big energy companies from losing future business, or what do you see as the advantages to this country? What do they see as the advantages to this treaty, sorry?
Yeah, so the main motivation for European companies for European countries to stay in this treaty is because they think it's going to protect their own companies, the ones that are headquartered in their country abroad. And it's kind of schizophrenic to see, because 2/3 of all ECT cases happen between 2 member states of the European Union. The European Commission thinks these cases are actually illegal under European law. The Commission has been arguing that this is illegal in front of these arbitration tribunals, and these arbitration tribunals say, we don't really care what you think, we think we're responsible, and so we're going to judge them. But I think we're going to see a kind of double movement from European countries, because, as I said, so many cases were between EU member states, and of course, no country wants to be sued themselves. So they will try, and they're already trying, to get rid of the possibility to sue between EU countries. So then an Irish investor couldn't sue Spain, or a German investor couldn't sue the Netherlands, as it's happening right now. But then the treaty would still apply outside of Europe. And so it would become even more of a neo-colonial tool to protect European capital abroad against government intervention. And we're seeing this in particular now with new projects like hydrogen. So there are big plans to produce massive amounts of so-called green hydrogen, for example, in the Sahara Desert, with all the solar power there, and then export it to the EU to make carbon-free products here. And so European countries are saying, no, we want our investors in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria to be protected by this really powerful mechanism and have their profits guaranteed. And that's why we want to remain. So yeah, it's total hypocrisy, trying to avoid being sued themselves, but then shielding European companies abroad against government intervention. But as I said, there are some countries that are more open to leaving this treaty altogether. So like France or Spain, and we really hope to win over more countries to build a coalition that actually leaves this treaty instead of turning it into this tool of exploiting the global south.
Cool, great. Thanks for that, Fabian. So a question for Sue now. Could we ask something about what needs to happen regarding the campaign to stop LNG in Ireland? So steps that needs to happen for that. And also got asked to tell us a bit more about what's happening in the north regarding fracking.
Okay. After I ranted too long and had to be cut off. Yeah, well, I'd gone through most of the north. The only thing maybe that I hadn't mentioned was that the decision will be made regarding the kind of moratorium or the licenses being granted. That has to go to the executive, and that will be happening during the summer. But you know, it's not doesn't look like a kind of promising situation, because like I said, the organization who Hatch Regeneris, I mean, they do not seem like an organization who are going to do things in a manner that is in any way wholesome or environmentally conscious. So that's not positive. Also, you know, there's been issues around vested interest. For example, the second application that I mentioned in Fermanagh from the company there, that was actually their community liaison officer is married to Nicola Mallon, you know, so there's all these different aspects at play that give the impression that this doesn't seem to be kind of a genuine examination of you know, fracking, or it's likely that the licenses will be granted from what we can tell. But yeah, that's kind of the situation in the north. And as much as I know, obviously I'm not in the north, so I'm not an expert. People that are doing the work up there would know a lot better than me, so I hope I haven't said anything out of place. In terms of what needs to happen here for organising for LNG, I think one of the most important things is for groups to be unified. I think there is often, you know, a tendency for kind of groups to be kind of quite split and fractured, and that was something that groups had really come together and were working together in a really unified way up until kind of COVID hit. Do you know, when you think of summer 2019 and everything, there was a huge kind of energy around the movement and massive mobilizations and loads of networking. I think all the activists and all the different groups really need to kind of try and work together and be very focused and strategic on LNG, especially at the moment. But yeah, there's so many issues, and that's one thing with Shale Must Fall, where we do want, obviously our main focus is shale, but we do want it to be kind of a international platform for solidarity, so that if there's somebody who's having an issue with a certain company wherever in the world, that the rest of the members can rally behind. And like that, for example, you know, you can hit headquarters, or if it's an oil company, you can hit the petrol stations, or if you don't have them, you can hit the financiers who are supporting them, you know. So like we went to Blackrock as well, because we were connected with the guys in Uganda who were being really affected by some of their actions there. So there's so many targets, but I think it's so important that we are connected, and that we're all kind of moving in a unified way, because activism is going to be so difficult now in the time of COVID and whatever other pandemics are going to come, that we need to be working in a really organized and unified way, I think, because what we're trying to take on is so enormous, and these people don't take no for an answer. So we really, really have to be as strong as we possibly can. And I think the main thing is being unified and in communication. That'd be one of the main things for me anyway.
Cool, great. Thanks for that, Sue. So maybe I'll come to Andrej again, maybe. And the question is, some argued that given the huge investment needed to overhaul the energy system, ending the ECT could have a negative impact on the energy transition by increasing risks to investors. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first off, the Energy Charter Treaty itself is an obstacle to the energy transition. And I think there's loads of examples showing that. Fabian mentioned a few, Slovenian case being one. And it's only kicking in, I'm afraid, because there's going to be more and more coal phase out plans and things like that, meaning more potential lawsuits, unfortunately. But in the past, there have been similar claims that investment protection spurs investment, but apparently, to my understanding, there have been some studies conducted, and they did not find any empirical evidence or link between investment protection and the extent of investments made in that specific country. Maybe Fabian can add a little bit more on that, because I'm not that certain about it, but I did hear about it. And end of the day, let's not forget also about the democratization of the energy transition, where local communities, households themselves become prosumers, provide their own energy, and own the resources to basically have capacities to produce electricity energy from renewable energy, so it's not just big players and institutional investors here. It's also us being the ones that are part of this energy transition, having a role to play in as well.
Cool, great. Thanks, Andrej. Do you have any to add on that, Fabian?
I think Andrej really said it all. I can only second what he said, that we recently looked into the studies that were investigating whether these kind of investment treaties like the ECT or CETA, whether they actually increase investment, because that's the big claim that's being made why we need them, that's the big benefit they bring and why countries should sign them, and there's no evidence for that. So it's totally a false promise that's being made, and so there's no indication whatsoever that for the transition to renewable energies we need treaties like this, that renewable investors need them, and to the contrary, what we're seeing is multi-billion euro lawsuits by fossil fuel companies. So
cool. Great. Thanks a million. So yeah, we're coming up to 9 o'clock now, so I'll leave it at that for the questions for the moment, and I'll pass it back to Nancy to finish off.
Thanks, Owen. Well, I'd like to firstly thank our three speakers, Susan, Andrej, and Fabian. It's been a really insightful and accessible talk. I think it's been a bit of dense material, but I feel that I got a lot of that, and I've definitely learned some really important nuggets of information to take to wider conversations with folks to really help scrap this treaty, which obviously we can see the link strongly with the CETA campaign that we've also been highlighting. So I definitely urge everyone who's joined us this evening to spread the word and share the webinar link when we put it up with friend and foe. And I'd just like to say a big thanks to our techie person, Sav, for running things behind the scene very smoothly, for obviously Owen for facilitating the question sessions. Laura and Sian have been moderating and the chat, gathering questions. And Jacinta and Anya have helped out lots with research and promoting the event. So all big thanks to all the Slí Eile folks behind the scenes. And we'll link up all the relative websites and the presentation from Fabian and all that on the YouTube channel once we put up the video. So we'll close now with some music from Siobhan Kavanagh. So stick around for just a couple more minutes. So Gurv Mila Mahaga, Agwif Agus Ihua.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for the talk. It was brilliant and really enjoyed it. This song is written by Ewan McCall, and there's also versions of it made famous by Francis Black. So I'll give it a go. It's called Legal Illegal. Every time you pick up a newspaper, every time you switch on the TV, you can bet your old boots at some point you'll see a high-ranking Garda or else a TD calling on all who are born to be free, to stand and defend law and order. It's illegal to kill off a landlord or to squat and abandon the state, but to rake up the rents of a house is okay, to condemn two adults and children to stay in a hotel that's rotten and damned with decay. It's a thing that is perfectly legal. If your job turns you into a zombie, then it's legal to feel some despair. But don't get aggressive and don't get too smart. For feck's sake, don't upset the old apple cart. Remember, your boss has your interest at heart, and it grieves him to see you unhappy. If you fashion a bomb in your kitchen, you are guilty of breaking the law. But a bloody new nuclear plant is okay, and a plutonium processing hastens the day. This bright little isle will be blasted away. Nonetheless, it is perfectly legal. It's illegal if you are a traveler to camp on the side of the road. But it's proper and right for the rich and the great to live in a mansion or own an estate that was got from the people with pillage and rape. And that's what they call a tradition. It's illegal to kill off your missus or to poison your old man's tea. But poison the rivers, the seas, and the sky, and poison the minds of a nation with lies. It's all in the interest of free enterprise. Nonetheless, it is perfectly legal. Well, it's legal to sing on the telly, but they make bloody sure that you don't. To sing about racists and fascists and creeps and those in high places that live off the weak. And those who are selling us right up the creek, the twisters, the tankers, the conmen, the fakers, the whole bloody gang of exploiters. Thank you.
Thanks, Siobhan. Lovely voice.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to everyone again.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thanks to all.